API design matters. And API design is more than just designing APIs. It's actually a whole process of going from a domain that you want to expose to your final design. And to talk about the subtleties and the processes around this, we have David Biesack here, Chief API Officer at Apiture. Hey, David, thanks for joining.
Hello, Eric. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so this is the second part of a series that we call The Language of API Design. And it's part of a series of articles you wrote on your Substack, which is called API Design Matters. And the last time, let's very briefly recap what we did last time, because that's the first thing in the series. And if you haven't seen that, you probably should go back and watch it. So what did we cover in our first part?
Right. So the first time we went kind of back to the beginning. Where does API design really start? And that's going back to your product requirements. Who's going to be consuming your API? What do they need to achieve with the API? What are its business goals? And that establishes the framework in which you then do your API design. So the first part of the series talked about that whole domain modeling part and building your ubiquitous language so everybody understands what the API is and what it's about. And then the next few articles that we're going to talk about today dive into the next phase of that, which is actually defining an API that implements that domain model and solves the business problems that you're really shooting to solve.
And just for our viewers, the one thing that I really kept in mind from your series was API first is not API first, or you said something like this, right? Basically pointing out that think about your domain first. Right?
Exactly.
That was an excellent point. So in the first part, we have thought about the domain, we have modeled the domain, we have kind of a domain model. And today we'll talk about how to turn that into an OpenAPI description.
Right. So this is basically the first way that we get a concrete artifact out of this process. So we started with this domain model that we built, and the article is called From Domain Model to OpenAPI. And I walk through the initial phases of mapping that model into an OpenAPI expression. So we first create the stub of an OpenAPI document, and it's written in YAML, and then we define the possible API paths or routes for the primary resources in the domain. So here we're looking at, what are the first set of API operations that satisfy some of the behavior requirements from that domain model. And we discuss the basic resource-oriented architecture and URL structures for those API resources. And we kind of focus on creating this logical structure for, what are called clean URLs that reveal the intention of the API and reveal what the resources are that the API is managing and manipulating. So the first article really is kind of this first deep dive into common API design patterns that you see over and over again when you take these concepts that your API is designed around and map them into OpenAPI with reusable design elements that recur over and over again. And that aids consistency and in ease of use. So the first article is all about that first step of making that concrete artifact.
Mm-hmm. And I guess you could say that it's a little bit like kind of the outmost surface of your API, right? It gives you those URIs that are visible. It's like in your like designing a website, right? Where the first you think about which pages should I have so that people actually know where to go, and then I can link between pages and all these kind of things. So now that we have that, what's the next step? What's the next article where you take your readers to go through this design process?
Yeah, so the next step is fleshing out the rest of each of these API operations. So we know we're going to make a request to get a list of chains or a list of characters in this universe, or a list of universes, or a list of authors, et cetera. So we have all these different resources in this chain link social media app. And so we talk about how do you actually express what the API is returning, and that's defined with JSON schema. And so we talk about how to lay out a JSON schema, embed that within the OpenAPI document to express what are the results from these API operations. An API is not going to be useful if they don't return anything to the callers. So we talk about that. We map the domain-driven design value objects that we came up with from that first modeling exercise. How do you map those value objects into JSON schemas? And I focus on JSON schemas as like another one of these languages of API design. We have domain-driven design in which you create your ubiquitous language. We have OpenAPI as a language, and now we've got JSON schema. So that polyglot aspect of an API designer's work is kind of expressed here.
Mm-hmm. And I like the way, how you're kind of setting these things up. So first you think about the URIs, the paths that you have. Then you talk about what do I get when I interact with those, and that's important. And then you go one step further and say, well, there's not just the happy path. There are also things can go wrong, right? So that's the next article. So tell us a little bit about what you're covering there.
Yeah, so that second article was called "What Am I Getting Out of This?" How do you express what comes out of the API? And the next article is called "Your API Has Problems, Deal with It." And this is really just reflecting reality. Every API has problems. You may have a really elegant design, but people are going to call your API incorrectly. They're going to pass bad data to it, and things like that. So really, we focus here on very early on, you want to design error handling into your API so it's very clear and evident how errors are handled. And we use RFC 7807, the application/problem plus JSON standard to represent error responses. And we talk about how those are coded into the various response codes in an OpenAPI document. So you can say, well, if everything goes well, you have a 200 response that lists, these characters or authors in your system. But if an error occurs, we're going to return a 400 or a 422 or a 409 or whatever. And it's going to be described using this standard error response. And again, this is focusing again on those patterns of use that build consistency into an API design across all aspects of the API, including error handling.
Yeah, and the way you set it up, I think this error handling can be looked at in two ways. On the one hand, you want to have error handling. That's a good point. But then you also say, well, and that's the next article actually then, right? Saying instead of always reinventing everything that you have to do, surprise, surprise, error handling is actually something that a lot of people are doing and you're doing, and hopefully in all of your APIs, right? So then the next and the last article that we'll discuss today then talks about this idea of reusing as many things as possible.
Right. So the next article is called "Don't Repeat Yourself When Designing APIs," and it focuses on that DRY principle, don't repeat yourself. So your journey of implementing API ideas with OpenAPI designs, we've kind of gotten to a critical mass there. If you kept following what we talked about in the first few articles, you get a very verbose definition. If you just add the same schemas for your responses over and over again inside each of those paths. But OpenAPI provides a way for you to put those definitions of schemas, standard responses, query parameters, et cetera, into a component model that you can then reference and reuse throughout the rest of your API. So we talk about how to restructure the API using OpenAPI to use these component models to avoid copious copying and pasting, which leads to fragile code and increased likelihood of bugs. And we talk about kind of the benefits of DRY, which I won't do here, but it covers it in the article, all the great reasons one would want to use this component model and the benefits you get from it.
Yes, and like you say, the don't repeat yourself is a very old and very useful and also like a very well-established principle. So it definitely makes sense to think about that. And the other thing that you said, I thought is very interesting, right? As soon as you start copy pasting things, I think it's always a good moment to think about, should I really copy paste this or should I manage this in a different way, right? So that I still know where it came from. Maybe I can actually reuse it in different ways. And OpenAPI does have some mechanisms there. So would it be fair to say that for this series of articles that we discussed today, those mostly focus on the capabilities and some of the features that OpenAPI has, more so than JSON schema?
Yes, definitely. It's really focusing on getting the essential 20% of OpenAPI that really gives you 80% of what you're going to need when you're designing an API. But the JSON schema stuff is again, it's another language. And then the next set of articles in the series will focus on JSON schema and some of its subtleties and how you use that to model API data.
Yeah, and thanks for that, because that's a good preview for the next part. And like you said, JSON schema is a whole different language altogether, so it makes sense to separate those things. And thankfully, those are cleanly separate in those languages, so we'll do that. So I think for now we have covered enough of those articles that we wanted to discuss today. I'll link to all of those, of course, from the description if you want to check those out. Go there and read them. They're also chock full of these examples that you talked about, right? A lot of things to learn from. Any closing words from you, David?
No, I think I do have some closing words. I think it's interesting, again, to what I want to focus on in this series is thinking about these languages and how expressive they are. And really it's a learning process, and you can start from simple elements and then you learn about the more complex and subtle elements. And that's what I really want to walk through throughout the entire series and the entire Substack on API Design Matters.
Yeah. And by the way, thanks a lot for doing that. I think it's a great series of articles. I think it's something that a lot of people should read. Oftentimes, right, I would say people might use tools. They might get a little bit away from those languages, but I think understanding at least what's underneath those tools, right, and how you should use them is actually a very useful skill.
Yep.
Okay, thanks a lot for taking the time, David. And I'll link to all of the resources, as I said. I'll also link to the previous episode and to the future one once it is available. And that's all that we wanted to talk about today. So thanks everybody for watching. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. Consider subscribing. Definitely subscribe to David's Substack, which is called API Design Matters. I'll link to that as well. And with that, we're done for today. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.